Okay, I hope you're all seeing what I'm seeing. Okay, are we seeing 1769, everybody?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
excellent. Okay, so just a quick review. Portola, his party, his scouts first from Pacifica see the San Francisco Bay for the first time. They discover this backwater. 3 years later, they finally get a ship to come in through there, having figured it out from inside out where they should be pointing. What we focused on last week was the Carquinez Straits, 8 miles long, unique habitat. And the three shields protecting Martinez. They got in the Golden Gate, and then they got to the far shore, Contra Costa, but they didn't get cattle over the coastal range until 1842. So when Ignacio Martinez expands his Pinole Ranch across to Rancho Cañada del Hambre y las Bolsas, so the Valley of Hunger. And we're going to learn later on that the doctor that comes into the valley, his wife, is going to change that. The other thing that happens shortly thereafter is the fur rush. And that takes off along the coast in the late 1700s, and it attracts the Russians, who have been coming across. For the Russians, it was go east, young man, go east. And they got, the Ivans got over to the Pacific within 60 years, and they just kept coming on to Alaska. Bill Walker sent around something with more detail about what the Sitka colony was like, and it wasn't pretty for the natives. And what we learned last week, that eventually the Carquinez Straits becomes a great place for uniting two huge bodies of water, the San Pablo Bay sticking up out of the Bay Area, and then this part, eastern part, draining the Delta. So Fort Ross, the Russians get all the way down and set up shop in 1812, which is a curious year. What's going on in Russia in 1812? You know, I can't resist these asides, but Russia was engaged in fighting Napoleon, and they win, which gives them great confidence to control the steppes and Central Asia. And by then they closed. But back to 1812, they've got Napoleon on their hands, but Napoleon has the Russian winter on his, and it becomes dire when the Russians burn Moscow, and he's forced into ignominious retreat. And this is a famous map of the number of troops that he took in and the number of troops in black that he came out with, just a sliver of what he went in with, a total disaster. And the hero of that was Tsar Alexander I. He faked out Napoleon a number of times after Napoleon's retreat. And he partnered with the Germans and the Austrians in the Battle of Paris. He is triumphant. He's the leader of this coalition, And he goes into Paris, Alexander II. It goes through the Arc de Triomphe. And fortunately, our French connection, Homer, just joined us. So I'm glad you got there in time for the Russians conquering Paris. Napoleon retires. He comes back, but he makes a bad decision about where to fight at Waterloo. But part of that is he's trying to avoid the Russians. So that explains Fort Ross sitting up there in 1812, while there's a lot cooking back in Moscow. But yeah, communications at the time, they probably don't even know. So anyway, back to Alhambra Valley. David Clinic has pointed out in his studies that Father Crespi crossed the Alhambra Creek. Sorry, this didn't reproduce very well, and said that the water from Alhambra Creek was sweet. It wasn't called Alhambra Creek at the time. A woman is going to change it, and we'll get to that. It was called the Valley of Hunger. A lot of fur all throughout the Delta. The Delta was said to have the most reserves of fur as any place in the world in the Great Fur Rush. And so it's no surprise that the beavers and the otters leave the Alhambra Creek. They'd probably leave most of the Carquinez Straits in the slaughter. But that the sweetness of the water comes back. We talked a little bit about the Alhambra water. I looked it up. I think that this is the original and only Alhambra water. There's a hot sulfur springs up in Briones near the outlet of the creek, the lead water, the headwaters of the creek. And we learned that they built a pipe down to the train station, bottled it over to Oakland. But then as we said earlier, came the cattle. And in 1842, they came across into the Arroyo de Hambre, or Cañada del Hambre, and started the other economy. We remember that the Spanish missionaries in Baja California had introduced cattle. And the Spanish did not know how to live off the land as the local natives had. And the only way they could figure to make a buck was to turn it into either fur hunting or cattle raising. And so this is supposedly a picture of Ignacio Martinez. But we also learned that because so much was central to the Carquinez Straits, and communication was easy going back and forth the straits with a ferry, we learned that in addition to Martinez being made the county seat as soon as Contra Costa was formed as a entity, across the straits to the north in Benicia, they became the state capital between 1853 and 1854, just emphasizing and underlining the importance of the straits. And then now we're going to get back to a part of the story that I'm quite familiar with. This is the first county hospital. It was built in 1880. This photo was taken a little bit later, though. And I want you to notice the eucalyptus trees. I'll come back to that. So we talked a little bit about John Marsh, and I gave his whole story and how he benefited from raising cattle and getting Native Americans to rustle for him since he'd cured their malaria. And he built this a fantastic house, which I said last week is in line to become a state park. It's in the works. But there's another house that was built in Martinez, and this is where we end our review of last week and get into some new material. I showed this slide to the residents, and everybody thinks John Muir built it, but John Muir's father-in-law built it. And here's the thing, he was a physician as well, only he was a licensed physician as opposed to John Marsh. It seemed everybody's named John back then. And he finally gets to Martinez in 1852 and is recognized later as the leading expert in horticulture, which is important for the valley. It's no longer going to be the Valley of Hunger. It's Strenzel's wife, John Strenzel's wife, who says, we can't have the valley named after hunger. And she thinks it sounds like the Alhambra, the homonym. So let's change it to the Alhambra. And Bob's Oxenberg has a whole riff on the Alhambra, which he has visited. But one thing that Bob and I have agreed on, that we should probably organize a hike back into Briones and see if we can find the source of the Alhambra Creek. So what's his story? He is Polish. Yeah, Bob.
Oh, I'm just going to question your grammar, John.
Oh, please.
Is it a homonym or is it really a homophone?
Okay. All right.
I'm not a grammarian, but I'm thinking that if you rename something from Alhambra to Alhambra, that's more like it sounds like it rather. Anyway, it's not the same spelling and with a different meaning. That's all.
I accept.
I thought it was an important contribution to make.
Yes. Well, I accept your amendment. I always learn from giving these sessions. All right. So what is John Strenzel's story? He is Polish. He is Polish, and he is in Warsaw in 1830 when the Poles rise up against the Russians. You remember from previous talks that poor Poland keeps being divided and disappearing. It happened a number of times in history. The previous one was when I think 1790s, the last additional land grab between Russia, Austro-Hungary, and Germany, and Poland just absolutely disappears. And unfortunately for Warsaw, they're in the Russian sector. The folks that wind up in the Austro-Hungarian section don't mind too much, and that is currently Western Ukraine, and that's where their German heritage comes from. But they have their own Joan of Arc, the Poles do, interesting woman, but they lose. And so Strenzel fled to Hungary. He went to medical school, but on the side, he also studied horticulture, which is going to be tremendously important for Alhambra Valley and still is to this day. He after graduating, he looked around, can't go back to Hungary. Let's go to Texas, so off he goes back to Texas. Hello, and we're having some coming and going here. He's in Texas. He gets a wife named Louisiana. Gold rush, he heads to California. But Martinez is his fourth try. He fails on a store he set up on the Tuolumne River, flooded. Ditto, Merced River, flooded. And we've talked about the water problem in the Great Valley, and he was an early victim of it. He finally goes to Benicia, where he has a contact, and they look across and see that the other side is the south side isn't as developed, and he goes over, gets land in the Alhambra Valley, and discovers it's perfect because the high hills that surround the valley protect it from cold winds and fogs, and which is going to be important for fruit trees. And as I said, he is recognized later as one of the great horticulturalists. I want to just mention Hungary's advancement in horticulture. I hadn't encountered this before up in Napa, hearing about people talk about grapevines and grapevines coming from Hungary. And what's up with that? Well, it turns out that they were one of the leading handlers of plants in medieval times. And it affected not just Hungary, but all of Europe. And they had a lot of experience with hybrids and crossbreeding, which are important for fruit trees and for grapes. And get this, they had built greenhouses in Hungary in medieval times. Okay, so this is a different kind of economy. It's not the rancho economy that you saw in the previous mural. Here you have what I think is Strenzel's daughter taking fruit down to the ferry. And here's downtown Martinez in the early times. Strenzel has come across from Benicia. You've got a lot of boats out there, either fishing or fur trapping. And this panel, I asked the residents if they've seen it. And it's a companion panel to the rancho panel. And they say, no, I've never seen it. Well, you've driven by it for 3 years, and you haven't stopped to look at it. You can't stop here to look at it. You've got to park your car in the John Muir National Park parking lot and walk out on the sidewalk. But these 6 panels, you'll see the others as I proceed. But this is the story of Martinez. So that girl driving the wagon to market, that is Strenzel's daughter. Her name is not Louisiana like her mother, but it's Louisa, and she's commonly called Louis. She had gone to finishing school in Benicia, smart woman, but nobody was attracted to her. But this guy attended one of Strenzel's lectures on horticulture that he gave in Oakland. And this guy is John Muir, and he had always been interested in plants and botany. And when you think about the Scots, just think about San Francisco and John McLaren and how he turned the sand dunes into Golden Gate Park. The Scots had an interest, and part of their culture is horticulture and plants. And that's certainly true for John Muir. We could spend 10 hours on John Muir. I'm skimming over the surface here to try to stay focused. But he was quite a guy. So he goes to Strenzel's lecture in horticulture, And there are other mutual friends who are promoting a marriage between Muir, who at this time is pushing 40 and has no prospects. He's been a wandering hippie who took off. First of all, he went to Canada as a draft dodger in the Civil War. He comes back and he goes to my hometown of Indianapolis and works as what was called a mechanic in those days. While he's in Indianapolis working, he gets a foreign body in his eye. It's pretty bad, and he gets sympathetic blindness in the good eye, which is pretty rare. But we were taught that, those docs of us that are here, that's possible. So he was functionally blind for 6 weeks, and it changed his life. He'd always liked the plants and wildlife, but here he was trying to make a buck, and he swore if he ever got his vision back, that he would just become a wanderer. And he got his vision back, and he set off for first Cuba, walked as far as he could, took a boat to Cuba. Then eventually he decided, well, let's give California a try. And he'd heard about and read about the Yosemite Valley and had lived out there and lived on nothing. He was very ingenious that way. And then every once in a while would come back into civilization and attend lectures like John Strenzel's. But everybody ganged up on him and Louis, and they said, you got to get married. And here they are, the happy couple on their wedding day. And this is in Martinez. It's not in that big house, not yet. This is Louis. They have a couple of kids. For those of us who have hiked around Martinez, there's a Mount Wanda. One of these kids is Wanda. This is what he looked like just before he got married from his wandering days. But after he gets married and starts working, and Strenzel can see that he is very capable foreman managing the fruit trees, the two of their talents together, the Alhambra Valley blossoms with fruit trees. And so Strenzel decides he can build a house. This is the house that Strenzel built. Now, Strenzel dies, and Louis and John inherit it. And so this is them on the front stoop of the big house, which is now a national park. But Muir by then has established such a reputation that a guy like Theodore Roosevelt knows about him and specifically approaches him. And these two guys wander through Yosemite over a number of days, just the two of them, while Roosevelt, I think it's while Roosevelt's president. Anyway, this is the Strenzel graveyard. One of my patients told me about it, told me how to get there. I'll show a map in just a second. And you go out to the graveyard and you say, oh, wow, that's a nice look. That's very modest for a guy like Muir. That's not Muir's tomb. That's Strenzel. That's Big Daddy. Over here are Louis and John Muir. And you can see John Muir dies in 1914. The death certificate says pneumonia, but everybody knows his heart is broken because it looks like San Francisco is going to dam the Hetch Hetchy, which in fact happens. Louis had predeceased him. She died about 9 years earlier. this is the map. If any of you are interested in going, you don't. Strenza Lane is closed. You got to go on Sheridan Lane. You probably should find another place to park and walk here, because this is strictly residential, and you are trespassing when you used to be trespassing. The national park now owns it, so you can go there without fear. But some of the residents might mind. I wanted to address this issue because we've heard John Muir didn't respect Indians. That's not true. In Wisconsin, the Winnebago tribe had his sympathy because he watched them being robbed and cut off from their means of livelihood, but he did not take to the California Native Americans, particularly the Paiutes. But up in Alaska, he did fine, and he was made an honorary chief of this Alaskan coastal tribe. But the Miwoks in Yosemite, he was pretty rough on them, and that they didn't fit into the landscape. We would have to get Connie Loosley and Janet Thomas to respectfully disagree. Harold and Bruce work in the and volunteer in the Miwok village in Lafayette. But later, after living with Indians, Native Americans, he became more sympathetic. But every once in a while, he slips. And he slipped often enough that there was an effort in the Sierra Club to cancel him. And a controversial editorial was published by the Sierra Club accusing Muir of being a racist. But they hadn't consulted the president of the Sierra Club board, this African American, and he defended Muir and said that the editorial was a misrepresentation, revisionist, and ahistorical. So Muir died in 1914. I'll take a breath and see if anybody wants to add anything on Muir. He died at the end of 1914. Earlier in 1914, a second resident was born of immigrant fishermen from Sicily, also destined for greatness. I think we've talked about it, and Jim's going to tell us who it was.
No, I was going to ask if anyone had seen there was a guy who did presentations by Muir down at the waterfront. Did you ever go to those?
I went to he also performed at the park itself, at the home itself, and I attended one of those. His routine, I think he had a dog named Stickeen. Am I remembering right? But you'll remember from that previous slide that Stickeen was the honorary title that the Alaskan natives gave him, making him an honorary chief. But he told a lot of good stories. And there is this book called The Adventures of John Muir, that I think there's about 25 of them that he published about his individual experiences over time. And it's a fascinating book. It's available in the bookstore. at the John Muir National Park. But if anybody wants to read John Muir in his own words, he talks about getting caught in a blizzard on Mount Shasta and surviving by laying in over the source of a hot spring and getting burns on his back, but he survived the night. He talks about being caught in a cyclone at as he was climbing the top of a tall sequoia, things like that. I looked to see if that guy's still performing, and he's not. But this book is a pretty good substitute, and I can get the full title for you if anybody's interested. Okay. So the second resident, and I think we've been through this. Everybody will know, or in just a second, wish they had thought of it. It was a son of a Sicilian fisherman that had just come in. He didn't have enough money to set up in San Francisco and fish out of the bay. But Martinez was a good starter town, being right on the Carquinez Straits.
I think everybody's being bashful. I think everybody knows who that is.
Yes. So the second famous man alive is Joe DiMaggio, who was born in this cabin, which was on the waterfront, but it is no more. It is no more. Joe DiMaggio, world famous. What do you mean world famous? He was just a baseball player. Well, anyway, you can go into downtown Martinez along the waterfront, and the cabin's no longer there, but there is this sign acknowledging that he was the eighth of 9 children. And he returned often to the family, and I've got a story about that. Here's his birthplace on the map in downtown Martinez, but here are all the other DiMaggio sites that have placards, where some member of the DiMaggio family who worked their way up slowly from the creek. The bay is, of course, a few hundred yards north. And as they got more prosperous, they could move further away from the water. And that you can walk there from the train station. It's a short walk. And this is what it looks like. The placard is hidden back underneath here, but this is open. You can walk in and look at the placard. They don't seem to mind. And you see the bay behind, the Carquinez Straits behind. But at the age of 3, his family moves to San Francisco. There are reports that some of the family is very allergic, and Contra Costa has a lot of pollen, and there's always some kind of pollen out, spring, summer, fall, or winter. There's some pollen in the air, except maybe a couple of weeks around Christmas time. So those of us who practice medicine in Contra Costa know that. So the thought is that there were allergies, and they finally had enough money to get over to San Francisco. The thing was, Joe DiMaggio hated fishing, but he was a devoted boy. He played stickball out on the streets. Some of us learned on a hike in San Francisco with the writer of this book, A Cold Gray City of Love, 49 Views of San Francisco, Gary Kamaya. Some of us learned there was a lot of juvenile delinquency in San Francisco at this time. And there's an inspirational story he told us about a father, Italian-American priest in Little Italy who decided to attack juvenile delinquency with basketball, something that I'm interested in addition. And it worked. And he, Gary Kamaya, also has a column in the Chronicle. It was called Portals of the Past. And he submitted copy for the Portals of the Past on this Italian-American priest attacking juvenile delinquency in Little Italy in the 1930s, and it was rejected. This has all been in the last year. It was rejected because it was considered a slur on Italians. I don't know, folks. I'm just presenting the facts here, and I won't editorialize. So needless to say, Gary Kamaya quit and no longer does Portals of the Past. But if you want to read about San Francisco, he's written about 100 of these columns on great places to find history in San Francisco. And I'd like to go on another walk with him. But Joey didn't like to fish, but he was a devoted family man, and his fame eventually helped create a DiMaggio's down at the wharf in San Francisco. I think this one says Dom DiMaggio. That was his brother, I think, played for the Red Sox. And
San Francisco back in the day when they were the Seals.
Yeah, I think DiMaggio played as a Seal before he became a Yankee, correct?
Yeah, both brothers did.
Okay. All right. Excellent. But he was a holdout in the 1938 season, and he actually worked in the restaurant, which I thought was amusing. But the Yankees decide to pay him big time, and he's able to help support his family, and he was a family man. But here's the thing. Yeah, I said he was world famous. He had some kind of charisma. He did. And Hemingway talks about it in The Old Man and the Sea. He says his father was a fisherman. He'd understand me, and that his father was as poor as I am. So, and of course, Simon and Garfunkel, Where Have You Gone, Joe DiMaggio? So he heard this song and he said, Haven't you heard the Mr. Coffee commercials? And so he was quite clear about his identity at the time. So I have a story about this, and my colleagues that worked in Contra Costa will know this, but our friend and colleague, Mark Vukalsik, sat across from Joe twice, and Joe, he only said one sentence to him each time, and it was cup of coffee. But that was the second and third time he met Joe. The first time he met him, he was taking care of DiMaggio's cousin, and DiMaggio would come over and visit the cousin, and the cousin knew that Mark Vukalsik was a baseball fan. So he made Mark write down your name. I want to make sure I got the spelling right, which Mark thought was weird, but it all became clear. He got a call down to the telephone operator. It was puzzled. He got there, and there was Joe DiMaggio, who said one sentence again, thanks for taking care of my cousin, and gave him a signed baseball. So the second and third time, DiMaggio was visiting a relative that had, ironically, Lou Gehrig's disease, and was in our hospice program that Mark and I were manning at the time. And by coincidence, Mark made 2 home visits when Joe was the one that was sitting with the relative. And each time he said that one phrase to him, a cup of coffee. It didn't even have a verb. The fourth time was he got paged to the front desk. Somebody said, Joe DiMaggio's here. So he's hustling down the stairs, and an old crusty nurse is coming with him. He says, where are you off to in such a hurry? He says, well, I'm going down to your floor. Joe DiMaggio's there. And the old crusty nurse said, as if Joe DiMaggio knows you. And they walk onto the ward just as Joe DiMaggio's coming out of a room, and he looks at Mark and says, hi, I know you. Anyway, Joe, through this charisma that has been described by many people, is married to Marilyn Monroe, but just for 1 year. One of the problems is he didn't like the fact that she was showing off her body, and he was kind of old school that way. And they got divorced after a year, and of course Marilyn hooked up with Arthur Miller, and they stayed together for 5 years. During that time, I think she flirted with the Kennedys or whatever, but he was hurt by that. His pride was hurt when that marriage didn't work. But he came back, and he lived in the rest of his life in San Francisco, working down at the restaurant. Sometimes he would just go and sit at the bar and be an attraction that would bring people in to the restaurant off the streets. But he hobnobbed. Everybody wanted to be seen with him. And politicians, I think that's Art Agnos. This is a very moving essay. If you want to understand Joe DiMaggio and his psychology and kind of the sadness of his later years, the silent season of a hero, and he just played the waiting game, but he had a supportive family. He continued to date, and as I say, would often go and be a meter and greeter at DiMaggio's. So 1914, we have John Muir dying. We have Joe DiMaggio being born, but that's also the year that the county gets a second hospital, more substantial. The first one was more like a sanatorium, because about the only thing we knew how to treat was tuberculosis, and that was just rest. But this is a more substantial hospital that is specifically built for a new kind of worker in town. This is around that time that oil is discovered in the valley. And when we're going to see how much oil changes California, right? This is gonna take a couple of hours to work through all that. But in the beginning, it's discovered first in the valley. And if you saw the movie There Will Be Blood, it got an Academy Award, starring Daniel Day-Lewis. That oil that they got has to be piped and refined somewhere. And Martinez on the water, on the Carquinez Strait, with the good harbor, is tapped. And this, of course, changes Alhambra Valley. Hi, Bruce. The valley, the Alhambra Creek is here. The prevailing wind, and this is to the east of the city. The prevailing wind is to the west, so a lot of the pollution gets blown into the valley and winds up in places like Fresno. And David Pepper, who's is with us sometimes, was a doctor in Fresno, and his special interest is air quality for this very reason. At nighttime, it can be quite alluring as you drive home at the end of a busy day in the wintertime. So this brand new brick hospital needed a doctor. And this is Merrithew, Dr. Merrithew. The hospital was briefly named after him during a spell because he delivered one of the members of the Board of Supervisors. But he was an interesting guy. He had been in San Francisco as an intern at Lane Hospital in San Francisco in 1906. And so he was among the doctors who were taking care of the injuries in the best way they could down in tents set up in Golden Gate Park. The medical school was up on the hill outside of this frame, even then. So I gave a version of what I'm talking about today to the Martinez Historical Society, and his relatives came. Merrithew's grandson came with more information for me, and this was his progression. But he became the Martinez health officer and ran that hospital. And the grandson provided me with a colorized picture of the old hospital. So that was useful. So this is another personality. He was a citizen of Contra Costa and always a controversial one. There's many aspects of him that you can discuss. The Teisel brothers will know from their sailing that George Degnan was a very daring, dangerous person to sail against. He was born also in 1914 in the lumber country up in Humboldt. His lumberjack father moved back to Richmond for him to go to high school, where he succeeded, went to UC Berkeley, played freshman football. And here's an interesting diversion. He goes not to an American medical school, he goes to a Canadian one, which will have some import for us later on in this story. And in 1940, he comes back and takes up a residency in internal medicine at UCSF, but he quits. He hates it. He goes back, joins the Canadian Air Force, and is sent to London for the Blitz for the duration of the war. So he spends 6 years in London as a trauma doctor. And when the war is over, the Royal College of Surgeons accredits him as a surgeon on the basis of his experience. he arrives in 1947, and so Dr. Matthew, he's been there 33 years, and he's tired, but he's particularly challenged because the county has changed. It has been industrialized. You have oil refineries have really gone into a high drive, and especially during World War II, this was considered a target by the Japanese. Martinez was, and so it became a military town at that time. And then you also had not just development in Martinez, but you had development in Pittsburgh, named after the steel town, because they built a steel mill in Pittsburgh. So now you have industry all around the North Shore. And in Richmond, his hometown, the Kaiser is building the Victory ships. So there's more business for the county hospital than one doc can do. So this guy comes in and he founds our a primary care residency program, which is just finished its 70th year. Not as always as general practice. Some of the time it converted to family practice in the 60s. Yes, Jim.
You might mention Kaiser in Richmond as well.
And of course, I should. So I'm going to have a slide that's showing Kaiser and his dedication to healthcare. But let's follow Jim's lead, because Jim's brother John worked in the first hospital that Kaiser had in the Bay Area in Richmond. So pipe in, John, if you want to add to this. But he was there at the founding hospital. So this is the kind of operation that Degnan faced every day in London. You know, we had tents in Golden Gate Park for the earthquake, but every day London was being bombed, and they operated under very primitive tent hospitals. So this is the early resident class. We don't have from 52 and 53, but we have from 54, because when a number of us started practicing at the county, this guy was still practicing. His name is Rudy Leong, and he's provided me with a lot of material on the county hospital. Now, I feel justified in talking about the county hospital and the history of Martinez, because it was one of the major employers in the area, and everybody in the town used the county hospital. There was Kaiser in Richmond, and there were other hospitals that popped up, community hospitals, but all along, this has been a mainstay for people who lived in Martinez. So I feel justified. This is a little bit more than my personal opinion, although I grant you I am talking maybe too much about it. And this is Rudy with his, as a resident in general practice. This is the first generation of what were called registrars. These were veterans. And they were very colorful, decorated veterans. I'll just mention two. The Asian, the Chinese American in that picture was flown over the Burma hump and dropped by parachute in Western China to help the Chinese organize and fight the Japanese. And he was working for the outfit that preceded the CIA. which is also, interestingly, the same outfit that Julia Childs was working for at the time. I don't know if you want to comment on that, Aiko. But getting there and being flown in and dropped by parachute was much more feasible than taking this road over the hump. You can see a little car there, but it's crazy. And this, he came back to the 2010 reunion. And he had taught a lot of us surgical skills. This fellow, James Lynch, who accepted me into the program, was awarded a Silver Star in the Battle of the Bulge. And he got his Silver Star for going across a zip line, holding one of his buddies with one hand and the zip line with another, but with the collar of the fellow he was carrying across in his mouth for additional support and stability. So he got the Silver Star. Degnan built a third hospital that wound up being like a high school in Contra Costa with outdoor corridors. And that was hard for patients. You'd wrap them up in warm blankets when you rolled them into the ambient temperature hallway. But that lasted until the 90s. But here's the point I want to make, and one justification for talking about Degnan and our system. He was light years ahead in healthcare delivery. He had worked in the Canadian system. He had worked while they were debating national health in England, in Great Britain. And that's why Churchill lost the election, because he had opposed national health that the Labor Party had boosted. So he heard that whole debate on a systems approach to taking care of patients rather than a private fee-for-service. He believed in universal access, which is obviously a pillar in Canada and Britain, way before it's ever going to be in effect here. And he started 3 regional clinics, which were important. I had done my internship in Oakland, but I had no place to send the patients when I discharged them. And then he started the Miller Centers. He had a relationship with a local politician, and the two of them recognized from a public health point of view that challenged kids being taken care of was a real burden for families, and it also undermined the ability to work and the local economy. So he built these respite centers for challenged kids. And this was his partner, George Miller II. And he was Pat Brown's right-hand man, was his campaign chairman when Pat Brown was elected in 1958, and he was reelected again in 1962, defeating Richard Nixon. But George Miller II had a kid named George Miller III, and maybe you've seen him on the news hours. He first came to fame because he was Leave No Child Behind was his first really big project that he partnered with another George Bush. And George Bush's nickname for George Miller III was Jorge Grande. So that's where he really made a name for himself. Nancy Pelosi quickly put him in her inner circle. And the Teisel brothers sailed with George Miller on a regular basis. That's because the Millers lived in Richmond and were well interested in sailing. Let's put it that way. But Pelosi really relied on George Miller III in getting Obamacare through. And George Miller III was influenced by George Degnan. He has said as much, that he was influenced by Degnan's interest in systems and universal coverage. And that's why he was all in with Pelosi on promoting Obamacare, which somebody like Rahm Emanuel was against. So the point I'm making, the reason I'm justified in talking about this within the history of Martinez is there is a connection between George Degnan and Obamacare. We can debate how strong that connection is, but there is one. I put this up because this is the only couple of bridges that we go in on all the time from Martinez to Benicia that are named after father and son. So this bridge is named after George Miller II, who died tragically while he was still in his early 50s. And his son, it's named there. This is the railroad bridge. And for those of you that have been to Port Costa, this is what made Port Costa a ghost town. But because before this railroad bridge there was no bridge. There was just a ferry back and forth, and goods were offloaded from railroads in a little town called Port Costa. And those of you that have been there, this is a part of one of those murals that shows the building of the railroad bridge in the 1930s. And it's going to put these freight ferries out of business, and it's going to turn Port Costa into a ghost town. They have a big, interesting, cluttered antique place called the Warehouse there, but that was a working warehouse where the supplies were offloaded from railroads to be loaded on ferries. So this is the signing of Obamacare, and Miller's in a place where he belongs. So the path from Degnan to Obamacare, I put out here. I'm not saying anything new, everything, but there's one new thing, and that's the insurance and billing. And this is where John Teisel comes in. This is the Victory ships in Richmond, and Rosie the Riveter. And this is Henry himself visiting an employee, and he has said that he built the dams, he built the Victory ships, but he has said he is equally as proud of the health plan that he put up for his service. And Degnan had seen that, and by the time I got there in 1972, he had already put into works a HMO, county-run HMO. It was the first federally qualified one in the country that was approved. And Jim was the medical director there for many years. And for that matter, so was Bill. And John worked at the flagship hospital that Kaiser put up in Richmond. And Kaiser thought that if his buddy Sidney Garfield, who John, I think, probably met and knew, that if he could make this work for his local industry, it would be good for the entire country. So Barbara probably knows because Janet's told her that this is what I believe. So I think this is probably almost a pretty good place to spot. Let me just say, Miller acknowledged George Degnan in the congressional record, and read in how much he had been influenced by Degnan. But he has mentioned that on sailing trips too. This just wasn't a thing. And Obama, by the way, acknowledges George Miller III for the work that he put in getting Obamacare passed. This is on the display case in one of our clinics named the George and Cynthia Miller Clinic. And the residents have never stopped to look at it. They don't know that it says at the bottom, couldn't have done it without you, as Obama wrote to George. Okay, so that's where I'm going to stop and invite comments and questions. John, if I misspoke, Jim, you got more to add? Let me know.
Well, I'll just add that the hospital in Richmond was the field hospital. It was not the tertiary care center that was in Oakland. So
Okay.
if anybody had to have surgery or needed specialized care, they were transferred to Oakland.
Okay.
The first hospital there was called the Fabiola Hospital, and it was located across the street from where the new Kaiser Hospital is in Oakland.
Okay. Thank you. Michael Stein has his hand up.
It may be a subject for another time, but I've always wondered why there's a VA hospital in Martinez. You don't have to cover it now, but my understanding was George Miller II owned that property and I think sold it to the government for a nice price. And, you know, I've always said, why is there this hospital, which for the most part isn't that accessible for a lot of people who live in the rest of the county?
Well, and you're going to hear an echo of this issue next week when we talk about, we've talked about the first county hospital in the 1880s, the second county hospital in 1914, the third county hospital in 1950s. There's going to be a fourth one. And what you just said was a huge issue. Well, why should the county hospital be in Martinez? And I don't know if anybody has any insight to the VA hospital. I suspect it was just part of a hospital cluster. I know that the labor unions thought that they'd have their own hospital, and that's turned into the Kaiser facility because they couldn't make a go of it. But that's separate from the VA. So you had, and then you also had the Martinez Community Hospital, which was right next to the county hospital in a brick building. I don't know. Did anybody have any insights on why the VA hospital was in Martinez? Okay.
All I know is when I was doing my internship at Highland Hospital, God, 1970, I did some rotations out there. And at the time, it was surrounded by pastures. And I would go out in the evening and there'd be cows right up against the fence in the parking lot. So it was in a pretty remote location, I always thought, for a VA hospital. It should have been in, well, Richmond or Oakland. I mean, a well-established VA hospital should have been in one of the metro centers. And Martinez never made sense to me. And over the years, I think, you know, they've kept it going. They tore the hospital down and now it's just a clinic anyway.
Yeah, you know, I was just a year ahead of you at Highland, you'll remember. So I had this exact same experience. And in fact, that the photo that I put in of the lights of Martinez refinery, that's what you could see if you remember from the VA hospital. Yeah. Okay. Any other comments to keep us old timers from reminiscing?
Jim Tysell has his hand up.
Must have been a back a ways, but I will, since I have the platform, I think, you know, George Miller had he sailed with George Degnan, and he also had his own boat. And John had a boat, and when George was going to sell his boat, then you know, John invited George to come sailing. I think John can provide more detail there, but I would add that. And as far as the development of Obamacare, I think Bill could chip in, because I think he met with George several times regarding healthcare matters, and that was one of them.
Yeah, that will be coming up in I guess it's going to be part 3 next week. The Pelosi Walker connection. All right. See y'all next week.
Homer, can you stick around? We'd like to talk to you.
Thank you.
And
Thanks,
John. Hey, John, I sorry for being late. You somehow got in my spam folder, and so I actually ended up getting a call from, or I've texted Janet to find out, are you alive? And so she fortunately sent me back and said, oh, here's the link. So anyway.
Okay, well, you can watch the first part of it on the video.
I will. Okay.
Homer, you look good.
You look like you're home, Homer.
I am home. I've been home 6 days now.
So did you go home before Thanksgiving?
The eve of Thanksgiving. It was been really quiet since our granddaughter caught COVID, and the